Representative Duran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Domestic violence is a much more common problem than people imagine in our society. As a stark and shocking reminder, just this weekend, our state was reeled by yet another mass shooting, this time taking 6 precious lives in Colorado Springs during an apparent act of domestic violence. Members, mass shootings and domestic gun violence are not separate issues. They are tragically and violently linked, and we have to work to put an end to them. A recent analysis of 749 mass shootings committed over the past 6 years found that about 60% of them were either domestic violence attacks or committed by men with history of domestic violence. The Colorado Springs shooting on Sunday was the 4th deadliest in our state's history. In 2017, there were 2,237 victims of intimate partner homicide nationwide. In 2019, there were at least 70 domestic violence deaths in Colorado. But these numbers don't really do justice to explaining the physical, mental, and emotional impacts of domestic violence. And people who live in violence-free homes can't always fathom the fear, the trauma, the pain caused by domestic violence. This is a pain that I know too well, very personally, and the reason that I have such a connection with survivors that rely on domestic violence protection orders to help themselves. My journey, my personal journey to hell and back began when I was 19 years old. I had just married my high school sweetheart, and I thought I was head over heels in love. It wasn't long after we were married that he began drinking. Shortly after that, the verbal abuse began. It started over trivial matters. It could be because he lost his temper, financial reasons, or arguments that I really just can't remember. Slowly, the verbal abuse turned to emotional abuse and finally into physical abuse. I lived every day, and I mean every day, in fear, shame, and isolation. Not sure what his mood would be or what would set him off. Not sure what I would do to make him angry, always doing what I could do to try to prevent it. So I would say he created his perfect world. When the physical, emotional, and mental threats didn't work, then he turned to threatening me with his gun. I remember one cold, rainy night when the sound of his yelling voice walking through the door made me shake uncontrollably. I knew he was mad and what was coming next. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see him pulling out his gun, as he often did, to try to scare and intimidate me. All I could think of was my little boy crying in the next room as this man threatened to end both our lives. I didn't know what I could do to keep my son safe. How could I possibly protect him against this out-of-control madman holding a gun? My son was only 1, and he didn't deserve this. At that moment, my life flashed in front of me. I was terrified at what the future would hold, thinking of all the beatings that had caused blackouts. I felt ashamed. I felt ashamed because I let him speak to me that way. I let him treat me that way. I let him belittle me that way. Even though I know now that I was not complacent in his verbal and emotional abuse that left me feeling empty, alone, and isolated. It was only in thinking of my son and the future that I wanted for our family that finally gave me the strength and courage to break my silence. That's the key word, members, breaking your silence, sharing your story. I told my family, I told my friends, I told anyone that would listen to me. With their help, my son and I made our escape and started a new life. I read a report recently that stopped me in my tracks. It stated that abusers with firearms are 5 times more likely to kill their victims. This made me think about my own life and the fact that my abuser had a firearm. It made me feel lucky and so blessed to have escaped with my life and our life. It made me feel guilt and deep sadness for those who aren't so lucky. Now I think of that study and I think of the poor children in the Colorado Springs home, how they watched an unspeakable horror unfold before their very eyes during a birthday party and on Mother's Day. I think of them and I think of my own son and how one small thing had gone differently. He could have easily been in their place. That same study that guns further exaggerate, that further empower and control dynamics used by abusers to inflict emotional abuse and exert control over their victims. Sadly, I can vouch for the truth in that fact from personal experience. Domestic abuse does not discriminate. It can happen to anyone, regardless of your race, religion, income, or education level. I bring this bill to you today because a person suffering abuse needs to be able to count on an effective mechanism for enforcing the law that removes firearms from an abusive partner. I ask for your support to please help us end mass shootings and help the women, the men, the children, the families that are in these terrible situations, and to help all the other Monicas that are out there trying to fight for a better life for them and their families. I ask for a yes vote on House Bill 1255.